Resident Evil.
A few weeks ago, my friend Cinnabon and I played through the entirety of Resident Evil 6 in split screen. Up until this point, the only other Resident Evil game I'd played was Resident Evil 5. I had no interest in playing any of the other games, despite owning almost all of them. However, as we played through the 6th game, Leon's campaign stuck out to me as a pretty decent experience. I wasn't alone, as many fans of the series also seem to cite Leon's campaign in Resident Evil 6 as the only worthwhile campaign in that game. This sparked my curiosity towards the series, and I just happened to have Resident Evil 7 sitting in my Steam library completely untouched. After I blasted through number 7 in only 2 sittings, I decided to install the very first game and start from the beginning. Afterwards, I just couldn't help myself and had to play through Resident Evil 2. After playing through the Resident Evil games in order of 6, 7, 1, and then 2, I feel like I understand the series much more than I did before. Resident Evil is a perfect case study and an example for all other game series of how to evolve properly. And they've learned this by evolving improperly. Resident Evil shows us that sometimes more of the same isn't a bad thing. In the wise words of many who came before me, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. By passing through multiple games that caused outcry from fans everywhere, Capcom and associated Resident Evil producers learned that sometimes revolutionizing a product isn't the answer. Sometimes all that fans want is the same core product with a few minor improvements. After all, isn't that pretty much what phone companies have already figured out? Before we begin, I'm going to give a quick disclaimer that most of my footage from Resident Evil 7 is in black and white. I felt that the game was truly terrifying with the noir filter over it, and if you don't believe me, I'm going to play the same clip twice and let you decide if I'm right.
Excuse me, is everything okay?
Stay back, man. I got this.
Get off him! I said get off him! Excuse me, is everything okay?
Stay back, man. I got this.
Get off him! I said get off him!
So what is the core of Resident Evil? What are the fundamental things that makes Resident Evil, well, survival horror at its finest? Going into Resident Evil 7, I found a few things surprising. Firstly, the inventory spaces allotted to Ethan seemed very limited. Secondly, the environments portrayed in the game were tiny, minuscule even. And thirdly, while there is a lot of action in Resident Evil 7, the game shines its brightest, or should I say darkest, when there's no action at all on the screen. In fact, the best moments in Resident Evil 7 are when Ethan is just wandering through the Baker Mansion, trying to figure out how to escape while avoiding the family. But we'll talk about this more later. For now, let's focus on inventory. In Resident Evil 7, Ethan starts off with 12 inventory spaces. Compare this to Deus Ex Human Revolution that starts off with 56 inventory spaces. Or perhaps we could compare this to the Bethesda games that have their weight limit to 300 pounds when you start the game. Well, that might not be fair. Those are RPGs. So how about other horror games? Well, The Evil Within 2 gives you 24 spaces per each category of item you collect, and Amnesia: The Dark Descent gives you 18 inventory slots, although one almost never fills more than 5 or 6 in that game. My point is, 12 inventory slots seems very low for a modern game. At first, I found this design decision a bit odd, but it very much made sense to me. By forcing the player to choose to either take health or ammo, never a surplus of both, that means that the player is always at risk of losing life or losing the ability to defend themselves. Either way, even the simple act of picking up health may give the player anxiety as they think about the handgun ammo they're missing out on. When I began the original Resident Evil, I was shocked to find that I only had 8 inventory spaces, and I could never upgrade to get more. Resident Evil 2 starts the player off with 8. Then slowly allows them to upgrade to get a suitable amount by the end of the game. But is inventory space really part of the core Resident Evil experience? Dead Space sure seems to think so. The original Dead Space was inspired by the spirit of Resident Evil 4. Guess how many inventory spaces that game gives you? 10. One can upgrade to 25 by the end of the game, but 10 is still a very low number compared to most other modern games. Something as simple as limited inventory space does leagues to add anxiety to any situation. When a player leaves a safe room in Resident Evil 7, they have to think, okay, I need this much ammo to get by, maybe one healing item, but I've got to keep at least 2 or 3 spaces open for quest items. By forcing the player to limit their ammo and health they carry, each encounter with an enemy, no matter how small, feels as though it carries a lasting impact. In Resident Evil 2, there simply isn't enough ammo in the game to kill all the zombies you run into throughout the story. You're forced to leave a few alive to skirt around them. When Mr. X comes barreling at you, you can try and take him down, sure, but the amount of ammo it takes to get him to kneel is probably about 5 zombies you could have killed. So instead, you run. You flee for your life. Your heart rate goes up, and thus, we get the horror in survival horror. However, inventory space isn't everything. Another thing about Resident Evil 7 that stuck out like a sore thumb was its small, claustrophobic environments. Even when Ethan finally gets a breath of fresh air and makes it out to the baker's front yard, he doesn't feel free. Every environment is painstakingly detailed and put together. Each hallway connects and feels natural, and in the end, the entire Baker Mansion is burned into my memory, and I've only played through the game once. Compare this to Resident Evil's Spencer Mansion. I've got the fastest routes to the east and west wing's safe rooms memorized. I can tell you the quickest way to get to the tool shed from the main hall. I can also tell you which hallway to take to have you run into the least amount of zombies or hunters. Compare this to Resident Evil 2's police station. After my first playthrough, which was just under 6 hours, I had the layout of the west wing of the police station ingrained into my soul. When I started my second run as Leon, I was able to navigate quickly and easily throughout. However, because each area is so small scale and personal, the little threats that lie within seem bigger. Take Resident Evil 6 Edonia levels. These levels are huge, sprawling places littered with enemies and zombies with guns. Yet there's no fear to be had anywhere. Because the players are given so many zombies to kill at once, they are desensitized and no longer afraid. I think any Resident Evil fan will tell you that one tough zombie in a dark hallway is much more terrifying than 10 weak zombies in a Hong Kong street. A story scale oftentimes dictates how much action it can allow. Resident Evil 6's story takes place throughout the whole world. It is easily the most action-filled game in the series. In fact, Leon's campaign, in which 3 levels take place in the same town, is actually the least action-filled campaign. A bigger scale does not mean a better story. To anyone who is listening, please remember this. A bigger scale does not mean a better story. I feel more pressure on me in Resident Evil 7 to just escape a house than I did in Resident Evil 6 as I was tasked to save the world. High stakes can raise tension. But sometimes, the more personal connections are what makes a gamer actually care and get tense themselves. This isn't just games. In Avengers Endgame, the fate of half the universe was at stake. Yet, I personally felt more tension and anxiety over a drum practice in the movie Whiplash. My point is, horror and tension usually come from things we can relate to. And usually, the average Joe doesn't have to worry about saving the human race. But they do have to come home to a dark hallway every night. If Resident Evil was a phone, then its inventory management and moment-to-moment survival decisions would be the screen. The small-scale, personal environments would be its body. The game's tendency to favor tension over action would be its internal components, its soul. Resident Evil 5 and 6 both tried to be action games. They favored large environments, pretty much endless inventory, co-op gameplay, but that wasn't their brand. It wasn't what they were known for. It wasn't what they were loved for. If Capcom wanted to make an action game, they should have started a whole new franchise instead of pushing it onto Resident Evil. However, because they made that mistake, they now know how they need to enhance the franchise. For instance, most phones nowadays give incremental upgrades to their cameras. It's oftentimes a major selling point. Much like how new phone cameras can convince consumers to upgrade or convert brands, updated graphics can do the trick for video games. One of the main reasons I originally bought Resident Evil 2 was for the graphics alone. The game looked beautiful. It's obvious that the team behind the remake put a massive amount of effort into the lighting and making sure you felt lost without your flashlight beam. I mean, entire game franchises have been built just on graphics alone. A lot of phones nowadays update their internals for a faster, smoother experience. For Resident Evil, this meant dumbing down the puzzles a bit. In the original game, the puzzles served a great purpose of breaking up the action and forcing the player to explore. But they're also what kept a lot of modern gamers from delving into the original games. Resident Evil 7 provides a map that tells you which doors require what key, and Resident Evil 2 gives the player very understandable clues as to how to solve whatever puzzle they're working. Puzzles and contemplation are part of Resident Evil. In fact, I'd almost call the original Resident Evil game a puzzle game in of itself. It's a core virtue. Resident Evil 6 tried to mimic puzzles by having sections where the player would have to find 3 keys to continue, but those sections are not puzzles. They're pale imitations. They're annoyances that make the player stop flat in their tracks and have to scour the environment and felt completely out of place. There is no sense of accomplishment at the end of any of those sections. Finally, phones update their software through each phone. making things constantly feel fresh and updated. Little changes that make a big difference in a long run. Resident Evil did this by updating the map and UI to make everything easier to access and giving the player a better view of looking over their shoulder rather than having a fixed camera. Not to say I'm not a fan of the fixed camera. In fact, I think that for horror games, a fixed camera has a lot of pros that are missed when the perspective changes. These little changes make each game feel better to play, as well as feel better to come back to after years of aging. The point I'm trying to make is that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Recently, a lot of franchises have been returning to their roots. Call of Duty released an edgy soft reboot that puts you back into boots on the ground within simulated warfare. Resident Evil redid one of their best games and made it just a bit friendlier to modern audiences. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order finally gave to fans who wanted a single-player, epic Star Wars experience akin to Knights of the Old Republic or Jedi Academy. In the end, it's never a bad thing to try and do something new with video games. It's okay to create a new genre, like Demon's Souls did back in 2009. But if you're going to do it, don't do it to a franchise that fans already know and love. Fans love the familiar with a little bit of new sprinkled in, and it's a hard balance to strike. But the publishers who listen to their fans and at least try to hit the balance between modern and old, they are the ones who will be respected. Thanks guys for watching. This will be the last video I post for a long while. I had 17 credits last semester, 16 this semester, and on top of that, a job. So if I do post another video, it'll most likely be in the summer of 2020. I've got a few ideas for a couple easy, fun videos that I just kind of want to do, but no promises. If you like this video, feel free to check out my Alien Isolation video. Thanks again.